Insight and innocence are diametrically opposed. Gaining insight means losing a certain innocence, and holding on to innocence means remaining ignorant of various insights. Bloodborne is a game about the virtue of insight. As a hunter of beasts, the player's quest is to challenge increasingly formidable monstrosities that must be dispatched through iterative attempts to learn and execute a winning strategy. Eldritch knowledge in the form of magical spells provide direct assistance in this goal, and coming into contact with the otherworldly provides the player with a currency called insight, which is used to purchase powerful equipment and summon help from beyond this world. On the other hand, Bloodborne is also a story about the virtue of innocence. The world is suffering under a nightmare brought about by the irresponsible ministration of a potent supernatural substance developed into a miracle elixir by mystical scholars. This elixir incidentally caused men to turn into beasts, and a subset of the scholars formed a cult, which, in typically Lovecraftian fashion, reached for power far beyond human comprehension, leading to the encroachment of alien influence on the world and the further endemic spread of the beasts. And inevitably, every initially innocent warrior who set out to dismantle the effect of the blood-borne curse was seduced as they gained insight to its true power, becoming the very beasts that they sought to destroy. So, which is it? I propose that while these thematizations of insight and innocence may seem totally at odds, endangering the textual coherence of Bloodborne, we can mediate them by taking advantage of the multiplicity of interpretation allowed by music to construct ways to hear Bloodborne in alignment with all the combinations of game and narrative and insight and innocence. Musico-narrative parallels in video game music have been fruitfully analyzed by Sean Atkinson and Wesley Bradford through the lens of topic theory. In their approaches, they gather various musical characteristics that project certain musical or extra-musical senses in order to describe the extent to which a given piece of video game music relates to a given property of the game's narrative. I would like to follow the lead of Atkinson and Bradford in defining a topic of innocence. This topic is itself a combination of two subtopics, childlike youth and purity, both of which subsist in musical characteristics that project subtly different senses of simplicity. This is a vague and loaded word, so I will be more specific. Musical depictions of youth tend to also project a sense of amateurism, or immaturity, which casts simplicity under the light of triviality. On the other hand, musical depictions of purity tend to also project a sense of religiosity, which casts simplicity under the light of austerity. The chief exemplar of youth is the trivial nursery rhyme, and of purity the austere hymn. Consider the ways each of these forms express simplicity. Both feature restricted diatonic harmonic vocabularies, short, chant-like repetitive melodies that arise out of text setting, and natural human vocal timbres, especially from female voices, whose femininity has a long and storied association with youth and innocence. Along the lines of triviality, nursery rhymes have a playful, sing-songy, dance-like character, and along the lines of austerity, hymns have a worshipful, solemn, static character. The high-register voices of nursery rhymes belong to children, which often approximate pitch inexpertly. Music other than the nursery rhyme that is associated with children may be similarly clumsy with regard to pitch or rhythm. Toy instruments such as glockenspiels and music boxes assist in depicting youth not only due to their nature as toys, but also because these instruments occupy the same high register as, and in the case of the music box, mimic the rhythmic clumsiness of, the child's voice. The voices of hymns sing about more obviously profound subject matter than nursery rhymes, which we can call simple in its fundamentality, or its focus on foundational topics such as the nature of God or humanity. Musical depictions of religiosity favor not the percussive timbres of toy instruments linked with triviality, but instead timbres that mimic the stasis of the pitch held by the voice when singing a hymn. The organ has an obviously associated timbre, but many other timbres, such as those of a string or woodwind section, can provide the sense of droning that strengthens the music linked to religiosity. As an example of the musico-narrative synthesis that a plain implementation of the innocence topic may allow, consider the music that plays during the optional marriage scene from the action RPG Fable.
And so the hero married. And for one day at least, the troubles of a hard world were put aside.
The waltz topic diatonic pitch space and sing-song melody with ornamentation from the glockenspiel and chimes express a light triviality. The female choir and sustained support from the strings and woodwinds contribute a sense of austerity. Additionally, the first half of the track features a repetitive melody and oscillating tonal harmony, both taken directly from the theme of the hero's childhood village, while the second half features elements of transcendence, namely the apex of the melody and its subsequent dissolution into a non-homophonic texture dominated by the choir and high strings. This shift from youth to purity parallels the narrative trajectory of Fable's hero, whose ascent was incited by the destruction of their village. We can therefore hear this track as a representation of the hero moving on from their past, toward a new innocence. The hero even earns 1,000 good alignment points for marrying in Fable. The hero's marriage is also presented as a break from fighting evil, and thus as a return to the triviality of childhood before their village was lost. The intersection of these representations places the music firmly within the topic of innocence. It is worth noting that there is a close overlap in the musical characteristics that depict innocence and those that depict comfort, domesticism, or familiarity, especially in much of game music, where the typical opening town is a place of both innocence and comfort. But the world of Bloodborne is neither innocent nor comfortable, at least not anymore. Instead of approaching the topic of innocence straightforwardly, its music incorporates slight subversions on a few of the defining characteristics of innocence, and then completely inverts or abandons the others. Here is a typical instantiation of innocence in the music of Bloodborne, from the track that the player hears in the upper cathedral ward of the Healing Church. This music makes no pretenses at any sort of sing-songiness, or reference to any dance topic. The texture bristles with agitated glissando strings that protrude from a mass of vocal tone clusters and noise which has no traditional formal or phrase structure, instead proceeding almost aleatorically. The only primary characteristic this music shares with the excerpt from Fable is the presence of the female choir, which I believe to be no coincidence. Of the 30 tracks included on Bloodborne's official soundtrack album, at least 24 prominently include the female voice, either as a soloist or as part of a choir. These voices invariably sing drawn-out, heavily reverberated lines similar to the ones heard in the soothing hymn and in Fable's marriage scene, which link directly to the religiosity component of innocence. But if we want to hear amateurism in the soothing hymn, we have to take a very different approach from the one taken when we listen to the marriage scene. We have to listen not for immaturity or triviality, but for an imagined desire of the singers to express pain before beauty, to make their wails heard apparently without concern for artistry. In other words, we have to listen for the form of simplicity known as primitivity. Penka Kouneva, one of the composers for Bloodborne, cites orchestral techniques inspired by 20th century modernism such as tone clusters, aleatoricism, tremolos, polychords, ostinatos, and soaring melodic lines, as well as the stylistic approaches taken in the work of Georgi Ligeti and Alban Berg as featural influences on Bloodborne's score. These maximalist aesthetic priorities seem almost entirely at odds with the core property of musical innocence as I have identified it, simplicity. But understanding simplicity as primitivity allows us to find an agreement between the modernist program, explicitly interested in objectivity and viscerality, and musical representation of innocence. As I have alluded to earlier, the principal method used to bridge the two in Bloodborne is the primal human voice. To me, it is remarkable that the voices in the music of Bloodborne undergo absolutely no overt alteration in post-processing. They thus retain their purity, so to speak. By situating the human voice as an icon of innocence, we can hear the instrumental modernist techniques cited by Kouneva as corrupting sounds, which, as in versions of the techniques that project innocence, threaten to overwhelm pure, youthful, familiar simplicity with a maximalist alterity. We have arrived at a significant alignment between the music and the narrative of Bloodborne on the theme of the virtue of innocence. Through the lens that I have just provided, Bloodborne's music clings to primal innocence in the face of incomprehensible corruption. Hearing the music in this manner means ascribing it a particular agency, which we must be careful to understand within its proper scope, however. It would be irresponsible to claim that this music should portray innocence directly, in the sense that we should be upset at the evils of modernism for robbing us of a hypothetical Bloodborne where every track sounds like fable. Instead, I claim that Bloodborne's music, like its narrative, can be heard to form a discourse within which a story about the corruption of innocence plays out, featuring the musical characteristics of modernism in the role of the villain. There is one notable track in Bloodborne's score which seems to emerge relatively unscathed from the so-called corruption of modernism. I am speaking of the music box lullaby that plays from behind a mysterious window encountered early on in the game. The bare minor mode, the errant chromaticism, and the tendency for phrases to start on strong beat dominant harmonies lend the melody a sinister edge, but this is without a doubt the single track in Bloodborne that best fits my description of the topic of innocence, even though it conspicuously lacks the human voice and any references exclusively to religiosity. The boxes it checks there overlap with amateurism. Behind the window from which this melody is heard sits a young girl who recognizes the player character for a hunter and entreats them to look for her missing mother. She adds that her father is missing too, and that her mother in turn was looking for him. Then she gives the player character the tiny music box, whose description names the mother and father, Viola and Gascoigne. In farewell, she says, quote, "It plays one of Daddy's favorite songs, and when Daddy forgets us, we play it for him so he remembers." Using the music box from their inventory allows the player to hear one of two alternating snippets from the lullaby. It seems at this point to be a harmless toy, but when the player encounters Gascoigne himself next to the corpse of his wife, as he is in the process of transforming into a maddened beast, the player can play the music box to disable him for a brief time, gaining a tangible advantage in the fight and recontextualizing the music of the music box as a tool to defend innocence by weakening the corrupted. Thus we can hear music again as an affirmation of the virtue of innocence, but this time in alignment with the game text of Bloodborne. Insofar as the object of the game is to defeat enemies, the gift from the young girl, an emblem of innocence, engages music as a weapon for that service. There is another well-known fact about the music box. After its performance at the young girl's window, its melody appears again at the end of the game, accompanying a boss fight against the monstrosity known as Murgo's wet nurse. Music in Bloodborne, as a general rule, only appears within the climactic boss encounters that shape the structure of the gameplay. In fact, only 3 out of the 30 tracks from the soundtrack can be heard in-game without worrying about a big red health bar at the bottom of the screen. 2 of these tracks happen to be the lullaby for Murgo and the soothing hymn that we heard as an example earlier. This creates an unavoidable association between Bloodborne's music and its bosses. In fact, it is not possible within the bounds of normative play to encounter a boss without music. Alexander Kolassa interprets this polarity between non-musical routine gameplay and musical boss encounters as a reinforcement of Bloodborne's graphic and ludic presentation of its monsters, arguing that when a boss is encountered, music's sudden appearance, juxtaposed crucially as it is against silence, proffers an inscrutable extension of the creature's monstrosity. Music, in other words, acts to frame the boss encounter, to lend its subject a sonic materiality. Boss encounters in Bloodborne typically feature a single opponent, usually larger than the player, who has a programmed behavior to execute certain attacks under certain circumstances. Being a video game, Bloodborne has practical limits on the amount and variety of attacks that a given enemy may have at their disposal, as well as their decision-making procedure, meaning that, as in most video games, it is possible for a player to comprehensively understand the whole suite of an enemy's options to the extent that they never allow an enemy to land a single hit. In this sense, to cite a comparison frequently made by the online community, the bosses are like puzzles, broken up by episodes of free, non-musical exploration. More precisely, boss encounters in Bloodborne are constrained ludic scenes that particularly reward the player's ability to interpret the game text. Ludic scenes constrained in musical frames. Entering a boss encounter for the first time usually awards the player some amount of insight points, which correspond with the player character's insight deepening as they are forced to reconcile eldritch truths. The player earns insight in other ludic situations, but in the case of the boss encounter, since music signals the appearance of an eldritch monstrosity, we can hear music as a herald for insight. This mechanic also enables us to hear game sound as a reward. While the main purpose of insight points is as a currency to purchase special equipment or to summon allies in combat, there are a number of sonic features associated with its accumulation. When the player exceeds certain thresholds of insight, a certain character mumbles revealing lines in his sleep. A particularly dangerous type of enemy sings with greater clarity the song that reveals their location. The music in a certain boss encounter features an extra layer of chaotic, indistinct whisperings. The music in a certain location changes its principal melodic medium from a string instrument to a solo female voice. And, throughout the game, the player may hear the distant cries of infants. These effects provide a rich ground for inquiry into insight and innocence in the sound of Bloodborne, but since the focus of this paper is music, I will have to restrict my remarks to the clearest ludo-musical connection on this list, namely the distinct gameplay benefit the player receives with sufficient insight. Here, music, as the Song of the Deadly Winter Lanterns, is again an extension of a monster's materiality, and this time a diegetic one, which the player character therefore interfaces with directly by using their own insight. Thus the player character, along with the player, can also hear music as a frame for a situation that rewards insight. I did not discover all these details about the insight mechanic independently. A huge portion of my knowledge about Bloodborne comes from the online bank of discovery crowdsourced from fans engaged in the production of what José Manuel de Amo and Anastasia Garcia Rosa call explanatory theories in their description of virtual reading communities. Explanatory theories are those that attempt to cover hermeneutical gaps, or gaps in the text, and Bloodborne only admits the player to uncover its obscure story through a highly fragmented, non-linear narrative made up of terse item descriptions and cryptic dialogue, riddled with gaps. In the final portion of this paper, I would therefore like to open a small window into the world of fan hermeneutics on Bloodborne. Many players have remarked online that the melody of the tiny music box and the music that plays when fighting Murgo's wet nurse are the same. Many were initially skeptical that this connection was meaningful, ascribing this recurrence to either coincidence or incompetence. But at least one player has used it as evidence to help fill in gaps in the narrative text. About a year after the game's release, a player by the username Negative Claim put forth a collection of fan theories, one of which was an attempt to connect an obscure character, Henrik, to a mysterious practice, the Pale Blood Hunt, or the quest to uncover eldritch truth, which necessitates coming into contact with the sorts of alien forces fought by the player. It turns out that Henrik was once partners with Gascoigne in the hunt, and Gascoigne's daughter, the young girl who gives the player the tiny music box, has a line of dialogue that refers to a granddad figure. Supported further by a reference to Henrik's tragically long life, Negative Claim argues that by granddad, the young girl means Henrik. With this baseline loop established, Negative Claim extends the argument to include the tiny music box, which holds a small scrap of paper, perhaps an old message, that bears the name of Viola and her husband Gascoigne. To Negative Claim, it is obvious that Henrik crafted a music box which plays Murgo's lullaby and gifted it to the couple. By characterizing the connection between the melody of the tiny music box and Lullaby for Murgo as that of diegetic transcription, Negative Claim makes the positive claim that Henrik, to have heard the Lullaby for Murgo, must have had contact with the alien force of either Murgo or Murgo's wet nurse, implying that Henrik is a pale blood hunter. This fascinating conception of diegesis is worthy of a deeper exploration which I unfortunately cannot conduct within the scope of this paper. I would, however, be happy to discuss it further in the Q&A. The salient point is that music has acted here as an interpretative way in for a member of the community to fill a gap in Bloodborne's narrative text. By hearing the music as a source of knowledge, as Negative Claim has done, for the purposes of deepening the understanding of a story, we affirm the virtue of insight with direct respect to narrative. The variety of simultaneous interpretations allowed by music makes it an ideal bridge between many apparently contradictory elements of multimedia. In this case, I have generated four mutually inexclusive ways to hear music in Bloodborne, each of which aligns with one of two texts, each of which in turn seems to disagree on the proper thematization of knowledge. It is difficult to read the story of Bloodborne as an affirmation of the virtue of insight, just as it is difficult to play the game of Bloodborne as an affirmation of the virtue of innocence. But, as I have hopefully demonstrated, it is entirely possible to hear the music of Bloodborne as both. Thank you.